Okay, so before I unwrap, I just need to clean up this. There's a bit of geometry here that we could reduce. So speeding it up, I'm just using the target weld to collapse these. Now here I've got a couple of verts that are just too close together. So these triangles, any triangles that are thin aren't a good thing to have. So I've deleted those with delete edge loop and use my multi-cut tool to just rebuild that. I'll do the same over here. So we don't want these thin triangles. So just rebuilding those with the multi-cut tool, getting rid of those triangles. So that's cleaned up. Okay, so I'm ready to unwrap. I'll open up the Hypershade. Instead of needing to make a new checker texture every time I want to unwrap something, I like to have a custom shader material ready to go. So that's what I'm doing here. I've just made a Lambert. You just need to build your shader network to start with. So I've made a Lambert and a file. Connect your checker texture. This needs to be located somewhere. It will always be located, so I always keep that in my projects folder root directory. So connect that up to the color. So there's your checker texture. Just make sure it's named something sensible like checker. Now save that somewhere sensible again in the projects root directory where I always work with my projects, and call it something that makes sense like my checker or whatever, and save that as a Maya ASCII file. So I'm just deleting that here. So completely new Hypershade, blank scene. Anytime I want it, I just go File, Import, navigate to my projects root folder, and there it is. A checker texture ready to go. Saves a lot of time. We're ready to unwrap. I'll start with the lid here. Projection based on camera. It's a good starting point. It gives us a model with no seams. Now I'm just turning on my edge width and the display border edges, just so I can see my edges. To start with, I've just projected this plane from underneath, from the y-axis. Now you can see that it's flipped. If I use the mirror tool, the flip tool inside of the UV editor with it selected in faces, that's actually going to cut my faces. So just make sure you're in UV mode there, where I've changed those. So that's just a quick projection of a plane. So we've scarred that down and moved to the side. So you can see there the texture border edges are turned on, so I can see where my edges are. So I'm selecting these inside edges where I want to cut these edges so that I can unfold the top sections cleanly on their own. So now if I select a single vert and control right click to shell, it selects that entire shell. Just move that out of the way. And now to unfold these nicely, I really need to have cut these edges in the vertical. So a quick drag select from the front there, grabs all of those, and I've cut those. And so if I select one of these shells and scale it up, we'll just use the unfold and just rotate it in the correct angle and just move on to the next one. I've realized here that I've actually messed up the order. So you just want to make sure everything is in order. So it goes left to right. In the UV editor, it matches what we've got in the viewport. So each one of these shells are in order. So they're all unwrapped, unfolded evenly, and we scale it down. We just want to eyeball that they're roughly the same scale. The checkers are roughly the same size as the other shells. So the top and the bottom's looking more or less the same. It's very important that we don't end up with dramatic differences, because that will give us pixelation in our textures. Some bits of the texture will be more high res than others. So I'm just deciding where else I want seams. So this is very straightforward. I'm just separating each side section into a single piece. And what I've decided to do, it's just, since it's a single plane, why not just do a planar projection? So select that whole plane, planar projection from the correct axes, which is the Z. So XYZ, red, green, blue. So the projecting from the Z, because I know that arrow is blue. So there it's red. That's planar mapping, project from the x-axis. Just scale that up and position once again, project that and just make sure it's my checkered textures are nice and square. Quick scaling. And that just leaves these individual pieces. Now these are all facing from the top, so if I just do a planar projection from the Y, one quick unfold. Once again, scaling to make sure they're about the same size, and we'll just reposition all of these near each other, ready for packing later on. Now before I move on, there's no need to texture things twice, so we'll get rid of the wheels, because I can just do one wheel and duplicate that once it's unwrapped. Likewise with the whole bin, dumpster, we'll just insert an edge and delete half of it. So once it's unwrapped, I can just duplicate it over, and there will be a little bit more unwrapping after the duplicate. Now I've noticed a couple of problems here in these sides, they just need some cleaning up. There's a couple of extra faces I don't really need, so adding those extra edge loops with the multi-cut tool just lets me use the target weld tool to collapse that bit of geometry, just keeping these fairly clean. Just running a cleanup to check that I don't have n-gons, always good to do. So let's jump in and do the wheel. We'll start with just the wheel itself. Just do I've projected, created UVs based on camera. Once again, I need to turn on the texture border edges for any new object. And I can unfold that as it is. And it seems to give me a pretty good unfold, because that's pretty much just a plane from a single direction. It's a small amount of stretching, but it's not, the shape isn't adjusted too badly. It works pretty well. Here I've selected the top, since this is just a cube with one plane missing on the top that we're not seeing. It's very straightforward, just select the vertical edges, cut them, unfold. And that's pretty much a perfect unwrap on that object, very simple. Scale that down and move to the side. Okay, for this section, a cylindrical unwrap would probably be the obvious choice, but I've just tried to do an unfold. If I cut one face and then unfold them individually, that works just as well. I ended up joining those back together. So I could have gotten this result just with a quick cylindrical unwrap, but this worked with a few extra clicks, just not quite as efficient. However, this cylinder for the axle, I will just run a cylindrical unwrap. Click on the lower little square there, and then you can rotate it up and rotate it around to the side to get the correct rotation axis. Now I just want to cut these outside edges. Select the shell, which is the inside cylinder section, and just unfold these outside edges. That didn't work for some reason. I've just done a planar projection. And just rotating them, keeping them nice and aligned. Basically, I'm rotating them so they're vertical, so the text on the checker texture is vertical. It's nice to do just to ensure that the texture, when you're texturing, behaves the way you want it to behave. Mind you, it's something so small, it's not a big deal. So that's the cylinder there unwrapped. These supporting struts for the wheel are just simple cubes. So once again, it's projected based on camera. And I'm just selecting those edges on the inside there to cut, which gives me the inside face separate from the outside. Quick unfold, rotate it so it's vertical, and likewise with the rest of it. Nice and easy. Just scaling, eyeballing it in the viewport to make sure they're all aligned nicely, they're nice and square, and it all is of a similar scale to the rest of the unwrap. I've just deleted one side here since I've already unwrapped the first one. All I have to do is duplicate that over since it was identical anyway. So that's the wheel completed. Okay, so I've isolated selection for the main dumpster. Once again, we need to turn on our texture border edges to visualize where our seams are. Now I'm just going through and selecting where I want to cut and clicking on the cut tool in the UV texture editor as I go. Now with hard surface objects with sharp edges, anything approaching 90 degrees is a sharp edge. When you apply a normal map, you will get normal map artifacts if you have seams joined. So we need to insert these seams. There's probably not too much to say here. This is a really straightforward process. I'm just going through, in this case, I've selected the inside faces to planar map. Project based on camera. And I'm selecting the whole outside section here of this dumpster to project based on camera. Then I'll just unfold it. So I've tried to just planar map from the side that whole asset, which obviously gives me a lot of stretching in the top and bottom. So it hasn't unfolded very well on its own, but if I insert some cuts, some seams through here, and now try to unfold, I'll just scale it up to make sure that works. Scale it right up. Now if I unfold it, it definitely unfolds much nicer than it did. And we can see we've got a fairly clean unwrap of that section. So just scaling it down and moving it to the side. So moving on to these main planes on the side here. Just scaling up and using the unfold tool. Making sure I'm getting all the top faces, the faces on the top section that I need for this piece. Once again, scale right up so that the unfold tool works correctly. Unfold, rotate so it's level, and scale it down and reposition, ready for packing later. Just trying to keep an eye on the relative scale between the different shells to make sure they're roughly the same. Now before I do this front section, I need to duplicate it and rebuild that model, because the front section, if I unwrap it and then duplicate it over, the entire front and back, the length of the asset will be stretched and just need to be re-unwrapped again. So I've duplicated that over, joined the seams, merging these verts, and we'll just get rid of the edge loop. Now if I double click that edge and it's not selecting, it's because there's still verts that haven't been merged. So I'll just increase the threshold and run the merge verts again. And now double click and it selects the whole edge loop, and use the delete edge vertex. So these big faces are very simple, very straightforward. Since they all have seams, I can just scale them up and unfold, and we're good to go. This inside section, I've selected the whole thing, the whole inside section, and projected that. And I'm just going to cut these vertical faces. Now if I unfold, that's a traditional sort of plus shape, which is the typical unfold for a cube. So this front, we just need to make sure it's nicely unfolded. And it just leaves the lip. I've decided I'm just going to insert edge loops in alignment with where my existing seams are, all the way around the asset, and then just unfold each section of the lip separately. So using my holding down Control, right click to shell, selecting just that section, quick unfold, and pretty much rinse and repeat. So we'll just fast forward through this section. Simply unfolding each section, not doing anything different. So the wheel section, just combine that into a single object and then duplicate them, making sure they're all aligned. This cylinder at the back, we just need to make sure that's connected as one piece. So merge those verts after the duplication and delete the edge vertex. And we'll just do a cylindrical unwrap on these faces. Click the little plus on the side to let you rotate the selection. You can just enter the value on the side there in your channel box. And I'll just unfold it in the texture editor, make sure that's nice. Scale it down, move it away. Now these side sections. It's a very simple shape. Just going to do the inside section on its own. So we'll just select those edges and cut them. I'll just select those faces and convert to UV. Just want to unfold them so that shape unfolds quickly. And for this section, I'm just unfolding the whole lot. I've added a seam underneath so that it does unfold quickly. These are the same shapes. I could have just done one and then duplicated it over and deleting the other side, obviously. But it's such a quick, simple unfold. Such a quick, simple unwrap. I just unwrapped it twice. Only takes a moment. Okay, so here's the dumpster. Everything is unwrapped. We just need to pack all of the UVs. So we can see all these different shells. These shells floating around. They're all joined together in similar components. Before I think about packing, we just need to make sure everything is a similar scale. Using the viewport there just to eyeball our checker texture to make sure it's roughly the same. Very important that we don't get pixelation from our texturing. Now, it doesn't need to be identical, of course. Some areas you probably want a little bit more resolution than others. So for example, the wheel or perhaps the bar at the back, we don't really need a ton of texture information on that, so perhaps we could scale those down a little. Meanwhile, other assets that are more prominent could be a little bit larger. So now I'm just going through and kind of like playing Tetris, only the lines at the bottom don't disappear when you get a match. Just going through and packing them into that 0-1 space. There is a button to do it automatically, but I strongly discourage people from using it because it's you have no control over how they get packed. It's really needs to be done manually to get a strong and tight pack done in a logical way that's got everything positioned exactly how you want. So of course I've realized the two sides of the panel, because I duplicated that over from the sides of the dumpster, we've got these verts on top of each other, these faces on top of each other. It's very important that we don't do that. This is meant to be a fairly high-end asset. We don't want mirrored texture on one side and the other. That just looks terrible. It's completely unnecessary. I probably will mirror one of the bin lids, but everything else will be unique, except for the wheels. One wheel will all be identical on each one, mainly because that won't be noticeable. You can see as I pack these, I'm making slight adjustments to the scale to try to get them to fill the space correctly. But I've gotten to this point where I've noticed there's a fair bit of empty space. So really what I need to do is scale everything up and just quickly repack as best I can, because that will then use up, by scaling it all up, it uses up that empty space. So sometimes you do need to repack your UVs a little bit and do it a couple of times, but the whole process is fairly quick. And if it ends up giving you an asset with much higher resolution texture, even just a little bit higher resolution texture, then it's worth spending a few minutes just repacking. It's not a very difficult process. If you're like me and you grew up playing Tetris, hey, this is almost fun. Almost. And keep in mind, when you zoom in, things look a bit different. So sometimes it looks like you're getting overlapping, and then you zoom in and you realize there's quite a bit of space. It is important to keep a little padding between your shells. There's usually a little bit of sort of overflow between the shells, because we're talking about a rasterized image inside of Photoshop when we texture it. So those pixels can flow over a little bit into the shells near them. So it is important to pack it very tightly, but you want to have a little bit of space between each shell. So looking at that unwrap, I've used up all the available space quite efficiently, and it's all a similar scale. So I'm happy with that packing. So this is a new scene. I'm just going to create this chain and export it out separately. And this is going to be a separate object that will be a child under the dumpster parent. And this is going to have its own texture with its own alpha channel. So I'm just making this chain link, a single link. If I select the UVs, if I select the vertices and use the move tool and click on normals in my move settings, I can just scale the edge loop locally. I'm just using the multi-cut tool here to insert a edge loop to create the appearance of like a sort of welding join from where the link would have been connected originally. I'm inserting some edge loops here to tighten that, but I've realized when I smooth it that they're a little bit too tight and hard edged. So I'm just dragging those edge loops out. selecting the top faces there and scaling them in a little bit. So when I smooth it now, it's looking a little bit like the sort of world effect that I'm after. So that's going to be the high poly source for baking a normal map onto a plane. And the plane is going to be our in-game asset with the appearance of a chain link just through materials. So I'm now baking just using the transfer maps. It's a very simple bake. So we can see here I've baked that onto a plane. Open that in Photoshop. I'm just deleting the background. We only need the actual chain shape itself, the link. And I'm using that selection to go into the channels, add a new layer, which will be the alpha, and then fill that layer with white. So what's white will be visible and what's black will be transparent if I use the correct shader in Unity. I can set that up inside of Maya. I've plugged the normal map into the bump map channel, and I've just plugged the transparency into the transparency there. Make that a separate file. So it's a duplicate of those two files. One's plugged into the transparency of the Lambent shader, and the other's plugged into the bump map and set as a normal. Now this is a plane. If we look at it from the side, it becomes invisible. So just inserting a couple of edge loops and dragging them back a bit gives us just a little bit of information that reads when we look at it from the side. So we end up with 4 faces. So super low poly asset. Because it's a plane, it's basically unwrapped to start with, but I'll just do a quick unfold to make sure it's nice and unfoldy. And now I want to build a little chain link, an actual chain, just by duplicating each one. We can see the illusion doesn't work too well up close, but we're not going to be looking at this up close. We'll be looking at it from a bit of a distance, and it just creates the illusion of a chain without giving us a massive poly count, which is important when we're in game. So duplicating those up. I'll just export selection as a chain and bring that into my Maya scene just so I can see how it will look. We can see it's too straight there. It's too rigid, doesn't look very realistic. I'll just select each link in the chain and do a little bit of rotation just to make that look a bit more interesting. I'm just centering the pivot each time. It pivots off in space somewhere. So some minor changes, but it definitely makes the chain more believable. I want to just rotate these wheels so they look a little more interesting. Of course, this isn't affecting the unwrap at all. So just a little bit of variation. Try to think of the small details. Attention to detail is always important. And I'm just going to combine the whole model into one asset. We just need to do the locking mechanism now. So I'll select this bar. Because it was a cylinder, just created as a cylinder and hardly any changes made to it, it's basically already unwrapped for us. So just a quick unfold to make sure it's nice. Scale it down. For these sections, I'll just unwrap one side and delete the others and then duplicate this one side over. So I don't have to unwrap the whole thing twice. So project based on camera. Start selecting where I want the seams. Cut those and just separate it. Quick unfold. So it works from the front there, but I'm getting distortion. So I'm actually just going to cut those vertical faces. And now when we unfold it, the seams will be so tiny, it's such a small component that we're not going to notice seams there. But we may notice a little bit of stretching. So selecting the inside edge loop on this piece. So that's a good option to cut. Just turning on the texture border edges. Selecting that inside shell. Okay, so that's not separating because I've still got some seams keeping it all connected. So this edge loop on the inside here, I'll just select that and cut. I'll do the same on this side. Decided to insert edge loops. I've decided to cut the insert seams on both leading edge loops. Okay, so this section, I'll just do planar projection from the X. Now I've hit the flip button there with that selected to faces, which has given me seams. So I'll fix that in a moment. Okay, so flip that, just make sure it's selected in UVs. If you have the faces selected, it'll cut all of your faces into seams. So we'll scale these pieces. Just separating out the sort of inside section. We're going to need a seam in order for that to unfold nicely. So I'll do one at the top and one at the bottom on the inside bits that we won't see so clearly. So this section really should be forming a straight line. So we keep running the unfold and it finally works. So that's all of that piece unfolded. And even though the asset in its default state in game is at a angle, there's no need for the UV shells to also be at the same angle. We can just rotate these, keep them vertical. It definitely helps with the packing and also with the texturing. You don't want objects in your UVs to be at an angle. You generally want to, you pretty much always want to avoid that. A rastered image doesn't like an angle, it becomes pixelated. Even at a very high resolution, it's something that we want to avoid if we can. Okay, I might just speed up this section. There's not much to say about this. It's pretty much the exact same workflow I've just done for the other piece. Okay, so for this sort of pipe bar, it's such a small object, we're not going to see this closely. So I've done projection based on camera. I'm inserting a seam through the center of it. So now I should be able to just scale it up and unfold it cleanly. It's got a little bit of stretching going on, but it's more or less a fairly reasonable unwrap. So I'm happy with that. We'll just scale it down and move it off to the side. So now we can just duplicate over these sections that are finished. If I snap the center pivot to the middle, we can duplicate it over, hit -X, and it's pretty close to where we want it at the end. The texture ends up going black like that using the Viewport Shader 2.0. Once you combine the object with the rest of the mesh, it picks up the correct shader. It seems the black effect when you've scaled something in the -X seems to be an artifact of Viewport 2.0 renderer. So I've realized I just need to make some final adjustments to these shells, make sure they're all aligned nicely, positioned well. I'm going to have separate UVs for these sections, so I'm happy to not pack them. I'm just duplicating them before I pack them. Just position that correctly. Okay, so now I just need to pack. I've just positioned all of my UVs around outside my existing pack. The whole mesh has been combined. I just need to find space in my 0, 1 corner for these new shells. So a little bit of adjusting. It's fairly easy to make a room for these new pieces. It's tricky if I want to try to keep them together, but it does work. So this fits in quite well, it just needs a little bit of adjusting, very minor changes to get it all fitting. Okay, so I've just got these remaining shells left over from earlier, which seem to fit in fairly well down here. Now if I just drag select these pieces, I can move this whole shell over so it does fit in well. So that almost fits if we just move this. Let's try down here. So it's just a bit of trial and error to move things. Now I've realized I've got a bit of empty space up here, so I'm just selecting all of these and scaling them up, trying to make the best use of my texture space as possible. And now just evening them out a bit, making sure the padding is sufficient between the shells. And that's the finished asset unwrapped, ready to be textured.